other countries, other time zones. Very cool. All right. So as soon as I finished this poll, all the way from Manaus, fantastic. Excellent. I don't know if you can see the results already, if I need to publish them. Can you see the results? All right, I'll publish them in a second. Excellent. Excellent. Very cool. Lots of different Brazilian states represented. So I'll show you. Here we have our results. So as you can see, we have lots of people here, I imagine, from the state of São Paulo in the southeast. But I'm happy to see we have representatives from all the Brazilian states and from outside of Brazil. So hopefully the ideas that we take a look at together here, you'll be able to reproduce, to reflect on, and try out with your learners wherever it is that you are teaching. And before, as I introduced the subject of STEAM, I wanted to also hear from you. If you are a teacher, because I know some of you who are connected aren't teachers, maybe you're studying to become a teacher, or maybe you're interested in the educational area, but if you are a teacher, I'm curious to know if you have ever taught a STEAM lesson or activity. So I'll give you a few more seconds to vote in the poll before I share. Because whenever I participate in these webinars and these online talks, I always say there's always a lot of learning that we get from the speaker themselves, but there's always a very rich exchange also of experiences that happen sometimes even in the chat box, right? So as we chat, if you would like to collaborate to share ideas of things and activities that you've shared with your learners, that would be excellent. And I think it would really enrich our time together. Great. So I'll share the polls with you. So we have lots of people. We have some people who have taught STEAM activities or lessons, others who haven't. Hello, those of you who are joining us now, welcome. And some of us who haven't. That's great. So let's get to it. I believe you can see my slides now. STEAM and English language teaching. Great. So I'll give you, so what are we going to take a look at this afternoon? For starters, we're going to take a look at what is STEAM itself, why use it, what are the possible uses of it in the ELT classroom, and then how can I implement STEAM? So as a teacher, I know whenever I participate in these webinars, it's important to not only take a look at the theory, but to also have practical examples of things that I can try with my own learners, right? So hopefully these will help you and will give you some ideas to try all of this out. So for starters, what is STEAM? First of all, STEAM is an acronym for science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. And it's an educational movement that started in the United States in the early 2000s. Originally, it was only STEM, so only science, technology, engineering, and math. Arts was added later on. And this happened as a result of the United States finding a need to invest more heavily in these areas, as there was a lack of jobs in the technological area. And as they wanted to compete very heavily with Asian countries like Japan and South Korea, which were investing heavily in technology companies, and the United States wanted to become a part of that. And this was reflected in the investment that they did in their educational policies to invest more heavily, to take a closer look at how schools can better prepare students to follow these professions in the scientific, in the tech area. Since then, a lot has changed. Now the STEAM has become an educational movement that has broader objectives that aren't limited to preparing students to work specifically in these professional fields. In many countries in the United States, primarily, also in Europe, in some Asian countries, STEAM is taught either as a discipline, which can be incorporated into the school curriculum. In many schools, it can be an elective that students can choose to take, or maybe an after-school club that students can join, in which they have the opportunity to engage with these types of activities and with these subjects. What about here in Brazil? Some of you mentioned in the poll that you already teach or have taught STEAM, which is fantastic. Brazil really is still beginning to take its first steps in STEAM education. And it's still growing quite a lot. So in terms of research and in academia, there are some publications about STEAM in Brazil, but it's still quite an early and a new area that's being explored and is being discussed. But it is expanding quite a lot. It is a growing trend. So let's get to it and learn a little bit more about what is STEAM, what is a STEAM lesson, and how can we use that in ELT. So here, if we take a look here, and as we can see, this quote is from before STEAM was STEAM, before they incorporated art into the equation. And so essentially, what is STEM or STEAM? It's an interdisciplinary approach, right, where I have the intersection of these different areas of science, tech, engineering, and maths, where not only do we have these rigorous academic concepts of these areas, but, and this is the center of it all, one of the core points of STEAM and STEM nowadays, is that we're not only looking at science or tech or engineering or maths in isolation or even together, but we're looking at how we can use them with real-world lessons. So how can we use concepts from these areas to solve real-world problems that students face, whether it's in their school, in their community or neighborhood, or in work, because STEAM isn't limited only to primary, secondary education. It has been explored also in higher education. And so how can we use these areas in order to solve real-world problems? So this is kind of the key idea of STEAM. So there are some concepts that are at the very heart of STEAM that we could say are some of the pillars. The first one would be that STEAM uses project-based learning as its main methodology. So those of you who have worked with project-based learning, you know that it's all about having students work towards an outcome. So the focus is not solely on this project that they are working towards, but the learning happens during this process. So learning is ongoing as they collaborate together to put together this project. And as a part of that, so together with project-based learning, a central part is inquiry. So it's central that the STEAM classroom is one that's focused on student inquiry. So how are we encouraging students to be inquisitive and to be curious and to ask interesting, compelling questions, and to have this curiosity and to foster this curiosity that's going to lead them to be more creative problem solvers, So there is a very important focus on inquiry in the STEAM classroom, and how are we asking the right questions? Are we thinking critically about the topics that we're discussing, which leads to critical thinking, right? So are we going beyond just looking at the content, but are we actually helping our students to ask the right questions, to be inquisitive, to think critically about the world around them, to ask these questions about how they can solve these problems that exist in their schools, in their communities, and of course, collaboration. This is also central. In a STEAM lesson, in a STEAM activity, collaboration is key. So students are going to be working together to, as a team, think together of these possible solutions for these problems that they're going to tackle together. And of course, this makes for a lesson and a learning experience in which the student has a very active role, right? So the student is not in a position of passively absorbing content, right? Quite the opposite. The learner is a very active participant in their learning as they engage with the content, as they inquire, as they debate, as they problem solve together to reach these solutions for these problems that they're going to address by using science, tech, engineering, arts, and math. So something that's important for us to understand is what are the roles of the student and the teacher in a STEAM lesson. And so here I have a chart where I have some differences between the kind of instruction, and what we're going to focus on is taking a look here at inquiry learning. If we remember, inquiry is one of our pillars of a STEAM classroom. So of course, this is going to guide us. So I think it's really curious for us to take a look at, first of all, the role of the teacher. So us as teachers, what's our role in a STEAM lesson? You'll see here that this idea of presenting content or maintaining control isn't really a part of it, right? We see that the teacher occupies the role of the person who encourages students, who helps organize their activities and their projects, and then depending on what level or age of students you're working with, you're going to need to be more present in terms of giving them more structured organization. The teacher is a guide, so it gives them a lot of guidance as they go through these processes. And the evaluator, of course, of the projects that the students come up with. In terms of the student, I've already mentioned how the student has this very active role in their learning. So the learner is a problem solver, for starters, because as we said, the students take a look at a problem that they need to solve, and the objective of their project is going to be to solve this real-world problem. To be an observer, to take a look at the world around them, to take a look at the knowledge, the resources that they have around them, to gather this in order to help to solve this problem, which also comes hand in hand with being an investigator, right? What we talked about in terms of being inquisitive, asking the right questions, equipping themselves with these tools, with these strategies of how they're going to solve these problems, and of being an author and a debater. This idea of being an author or being a creator is really important in the STEAM classroom. And giving the students these opportunities to be authors, to be creators of solving real-world problems, it gives them, you will find, and I'm sure you've already experienced, those of you who have worked with STEAM, a huge gain of confidence of seeing that they are able to create and to produce using their own knowledge to solve problems that exist in the world around them. And of course, as we mentioned, to debate, to exchange, since collaboration is such an important key, they need to know how to communicate themselves, right, within their teams in an effective way, how to communicate their ideas clearly and effectively. And so the learning that's achieved from this is that, of course, we are learning how to inquire as this process goes on. We work with conceptual learning, and the knowledge and the theory that we reach, it happens both inductively and deductively, since they are so involved in this process. And we reach learning that promotes understanding. And together we're going to take a look at some of this, because some of these positive points that we find and some of these advantages that we find of using STEAM are what we're going to explore as we take a look at, okay, so STEAM, that all sounds all very well and good, maybe in a science class or an ICT class, but how can I incorporate that into my English language classroom, and why would I want to do that? So let's take a look at that, of why do we see this trend of exploring STEAM in the English language classroom? And at the Language Institute where I work, Cultura Inglesa, this is something that we are working on. We have seen that this is a trend, that this is something that is worth investigating and that has had very positive and constructive outcomes. And so that is worth pursuing in the ELT classroom. So let's take a look at some of the reasons why it might be interesting to pursue this in the classroom. So if we go back to the research done by Piaget, and this is not anything new, these are not new concepts, but you will see how they are very closely connected to the STEAM classroom, is we know that there is a huge value when students learn through experience, when they are learning by actually and actively engaging with the subject matter. They're not learning about it passively. They're not just reading about things in textbooks, but when learners have this opportunity to experience, to be agents in their learning, the cognitive process that happens is one that leads to very rich and very powerful learning. So this process that the students go through of moving through, and as they assimilate new information, and as they are presented with a lot of things that are unknown to them as they are going through this experience, there is this disequilibrium, right? And so this idea of the student being between what they have already assimilated, what they know, and being presented with this great unknown, this cognitive dissonance leads to this very powerful integration of new knowledge that then, as research has found, is very meaningful to students. When students learn in this way, they're much more likely to retain this knowledge, for it to stay with them in a meaningful way as they continue their lives as thinkers and as learners. And here we also have many studied and many found advantages of having this cross-curricular approach. If we think about it, in the past, learning was seen as being very modular. If we think of school disciplines, it would be, okay, I'm going to learn and apply science in my science class, Portuguese and literature in my Portuguese class, English in my literature, English in my English class, so on and so forth. When there wasn't, and perhaps there wouldn't be, an intersection of how these areas of knowledge communicate with one another and how they can be used together in the real world. But when we get to the real world, when we are in the wild, as I joke with my students, learning doesn't happen this way, and we don't have problems in this way. So when a student faces a problem in the real world, they don't, and that they need biology, for instance, to solve, chances are they're not going to need the knowledge that they learned in their biology lesson in isolation, right? Maybe it's a problem that they're going to need biology and math. If we think about cooking, for instance, right? They're going to need the knowledge that they learned from their science class and from their math class, and add this together to solve problems. So if we're thinking about problem solving in the real world, that our students come across, these are not problems that come, in isolation from or that can be solved with the knowledge from one discipline. These are cross-curricular, right? And so Vygotsky and Driscoll talked a lot about this, how by giving students this opportunity to have these cross connections of what I know from different disciplines, using this together, this creates these building blocks of collective knowledge that then they can use in a way that's much more natural to how we solve problems outside of the classroom. And that's going to build up to this collective knowledge that they have to make them much richer problem solvers and better equipped to solve the challenges and obstacles that they face as teenagers, as kids, and as they reach their adult lives. And of course, there is a lot of space and a lot of opportunities in the STEAM classroom to develop 21st century skills. So the main ones that we see and have the opportunity for developing, if we take a look at the 21st century skills of communication, creativity, collaboration, and critical thinking, we have lots of opportunities to practice this in a STEAM lesson, in a STEAM activity. Communication, of course, since we mentioned, as we're following this project-based learning methodology, and as learners are here the agents and are going to need to be the problem solvers working together, which already joins communication and collaboration. They're going to have plenty of opportunities to communicate in English, to work with their partners in order to solve these problems. They're going to need to be very creative in solving some of these issues, of thinking outside the box, of exploring different pathways that maybe they wouldn't have otherwise, and of thinking very critically about when they're solving a problem and they have an array of possible solutions, of thinking critically of what's going to help them best solve the issue that they have at hand. So we have lots of space and lots of opportunities to develop these 21st century skills in our learners, which we know is going to better prepare them for not only the jobs that they might have, regardless of the professional field that they engage in, but to be critical thinkers, to be better prepared for their lives once their school life, once they have graduated and ended that chapter of their school lives. And as we were saying, project-based learning lends itself to a very communicative classroom. So here we're exploring STEAM, but our objective is also to continue improving and to develop our English skills. So there are plenty of opportunities, like we are saying, and as in a second, when I'm going to show you some of the possible steps and how we can organize a STEAM lesson, this will become very clear of where the communication comes in and how a STEAM lesson can help students improve their spoken and their written communication skills in English. It's also important to think about how activities, how lessons, how courses like these can better prepare learners for jobs of the future. It's often said that our students nowadays, we're preparing them for jobs that maybe don't even exist yet, right? We know all of the changes the world is going through without even considering the pandemic or anything. We're already in such a fast-changing world in which the job market is changing so rapidly, that research has been showing that the better we equip our students with these 21st century skills, that we develop them to make them critical thinkers, people who can think for themselves, think creatively, have this flexibility, understand critically, and think critically about the problems in the world around them and how they can be a part of the solution. This is something that we should be striving for in our lessons, and that working with STEAM gives us some of these opportunities. Now, research has also pointed to that learning is more meaningful through the use of projects to solve these real-world problems. So we talked a little bit about the gain that students have in terms of motivation, in terms of a sense of achievement when they see that they are able to solve problems autonomously, to help each other, to solve something concrete. And we're going to talk a lot about this, about how the learning is much more meaningful to them when they see that they are not just doing something for the sake of it. They are not just completing an exercise in their books, for instance, just for the sake of it, but that their project is going to have a real world application and is actually going to help someone or a group of people or their school community or something like that. This leads to learning that's memorable. It leads to learning that has this impact and is extremely meaningful to learners. And as we were saying, to have this continuous development of their English language skills. As I show you next a breakdown of a S.T.E.A.M lesson, you will see where we have many different moments and opportunities for learners to practice all of these skills. And of course, here it's important to see that we're looking at English in the S.T.E.A.M classroom, and in a S.T.E.A.M and ELT classroom, we're looking at English as a communication tool, right? For inquiry, for problem solving, for collaboration. So in many schools and in language institutes like Cultura Inglesa, we had this realization that, of course, it's important to teach students the content, right? Of course, it's critical that my student knows how to use the present continuous and the present perfect and the past perfect and knows how to talk about their hobbies and their hometown. But together with that, we can also move towards not only teaching the content itself, but of using English as a tool in order to achieve and go through these projects, which is going to lead to this learning that's so meaningful and that has this real impact of coming up with solutions to help them solve situations and issues around them. Now, great. All right, now how can I implement these ideas into my classroom? I think sometimes for us teachers, that's the burning question, is how do I move past the theory and actually put this into practice? So I'm going to show you, first of all, what is the framework and how can I start thinking about how to organize these lessons? And then I'm going to show you examples of 2 projects as examples that follow the S.T.E.A.M education movement. And all right, so since S.T.E.A.M is such a new area, this is one example of a possible framework. It's not the only one. There are many. This is the one that was developed by the Institute for Arts Integration and S.T.E.A.M. Most of them follow more or less the same steps in order to create an activity. But of course, it is possible to make adjustments or maybe to group 2 steps together, depending on your teaching context, depending on your group profile, whatever it is. And when it comes to thinking about actually what a S.T.E.A.M lesson would look like, because as I mentioned, in the United States, in Europe, in Asia, it could be that students have a S.T.E.A.M discipline, right, in which they have all of the time in the world to develop these projects. Here in Brazil, examples I have seen are, for instance, maybe I can't have an entire course that's dedicated to S.T.E.A.M, but maybe within your institution, within your groups, you could propose, okay, we're going to have a S.T.E.A.M week, or we're going to have S.T.E.A.M week, S.T.E.A.M 2 weeks project, or something like that. Or once a month, we're going to have a S.T.E.A.M day in which we're going to have an activity together. So there's lots of possibilities of how you can adapt your institution's reality and your teaching reality to incorporate a S.T.E.A.M activity or S.T.E.A.M lessons into your curriculum. So let's take a look at some of the steps of this framework into how to plan this lesson. The first one would be to choose a question or a problem to solve. And this can be tricky, and this usually happens through, of course, observation. So maybe And this can be a choice of the teacher. You can imagine that you're talking about the environment. You're studying the environment and students have been talking about environmental issues. Then you could use this to focus your question a little bit more. So it's not so broad as, oh my God, what problem in the world are we going to solve today? No, since we're talking about the environment, let's think about what are some environmental issues that we have in our school. Maybe it could be something like, oh, we use too many plastic cups, right? Or maybe not everybody's aware about how to recycle. So identifying what's a problem or what's a question that truly exists within the school, within the community. Maybe it's a citywide problem. And choosing, so that would be the first step, choosing what it is that you want to solve. Secondly, would be to better understand this problem. Why does this exist? Why does this keep happening? How does this happen? And understand a little bit further. Now, when we look at this issue through, with a closer lens, then you could see and you could apply different methodologies to try to reach this. So students could interview people from the school, for instance, interview the teachers to better understand this problem. And then when we reach the discovery stage, this is the stage in which learners would have the opportunity to research and understand what are the possible solutions for this problem. Now, this is a stage in which, for the teacher, there's a lot of opportunity for input in terms of, okay, I'm going to expose students to a video or a text in which we're going to do some research, absorb some of these ideas to start thinking about a possible solution, which then, of course, gives us a lot of opportunities to practice and develop our listening skills, to develop our reading skills. In this moment, you could present vocabulary that will be helpful in order to solve this issue. And in the application stage, this would be the stage of the lesson in which students would begin to try to solve the problem. So then this would be the more hands-on moment when students are actually putting together their projects, whether this is a model that they are creating, whether it's coming up with a digital product or service for something. But this is the hands-on moment. And as I show the next two examples, I think it'll help to kind of see the bigger picture of these things, of these steps. After this, students have to present their project of what it is they found. And so here, of course, students have the opportunity to practice their presentation skills. With that, of course, their speaking skills. And something that's crucial and a central part of this process is that learners not only present their projects, but they become better able to give and receive feedback. So here it's important for the teacher to really emphasize the importance of feedback, of how to give feedback in a constructive way, of understanding the importance of feedback. Why? Because after this, and this is also a fundamental part of the process, towards the very end, after students have made their projects, they have presented it to the class, they have received their feedback. Now they can reflect on what they did, make necessary changes, adapt, maybe start the whole thing over again. And why is this? Why is this such an important role? Here in this situation, by doing this, we're showing learners and we're teaching them that it's okay to make mistakes. Nobody gets it right the first time. You're not expected to get it right the first time. And that going back to the drawing board, perhaps, or making adjustments, making improvements, this is a part of it. And this is something that's great for them. So by going through this process, we are going to help to create this growth mindset in our students, right? And teach them that there's no problem in making mistakes, that mistakes are a part of it. Or if my project didn't work, right? Maybe I tried to make a project in order to help reduce the plastic, but in the end, it didn't work out so well. That's okay. That's part of it. And then receiving feedback from my teacher, from my students, will help me to go back to this idea and to try to make these changes and to get back to it, not be discouraged if something didn't work. Now, I saw some question about resources, book recommendations, and everything. Yes, towards the end. And afterwards, I'm going to make these slides available. All right, so then you'll have all of the resources here in terms of bibliography and some of the links I'm going to share with you. You'll have those at hand. All right, so I'm going to present two possible projects that you could possibly try out. But of course, I think it's super, super important for us to always keep in mind that your project needs to make sense within your context. So sometimes we'll see online a really cool project that was, done in a school in Canada, but it won't really make sense in your context. And remember that the learning is going to be meaningful when the students see the relevance of this issue at hand. So it needs to be something that really pertains to their environment and to your teaching context. Okay, so this first project is going to be more towards younger learners, so maybe kids and maybe preteens. So imagine this following situation. You were with your learners and you were learning about music, so you learned the vocabulary to talk about musical instruments or musical genres, or how to talk about your favorite band. And we want to play music together, right? Or we want to have this practical element in our lesson, but maybe our school doesn't have instruments. Maybe it's difficult for us to bring our instruments into school, even if we do have instruments. So, okay, what's our project? We're going to be making our own musical instruments with recyclable materials. And then you could, depending if this was the context that, okay, I'm teaching in a regular school, maybe our school doesn't have the funds for new musical instruments, then great, then we're going to make musical instruments for our music teacher, right, to leave in the music classroom so that everyone from the school can use these instruments afterwards. Remembering that this question and this issue needs to be relevant to your teaching context. So then in the detail phase, you could guide your learners to decide, okay, so what types of instruments do we need? Are we going to make string instruments, percussion, brass, woodwind? And you see, this creates already an opportunity to present this new vocabulary, right? So maybe they've decided one group is going to make a percussion instrument, the other group is going to make a strings instrument, the other one is going to make a brass instrument, and then together we're going to have a band of sorts, or a small orchestra. In the discovery stage, then students would need to begin investigating. So investigating materials, we could go into it and investigate the concepts related to sound, talking about sound waves, analyzing how strings emulate sound, looking for possible materials. What are we going to use? Are we going to use a cardboard box? Are we going to use tubes? Are we going to use small stones or beans or something to make a shaker? I don't know. Then you could investigate this in the discovery stage and also start sketching their ideas of what these instruments would look like. So mind you, if we think about in all of the stages of the lesson, and if we consider that English is going to be my language of instruction, for all of these steps, the teacher, depending on the level, of course, would need to provide students with the language for all of these tasks. And that's perfectly fine to use this scaffolding and providing language for each step of the process. In the application stage, learners would actually make their instruments together using the recyclable material. And then also a reminder that even though they're going to be working hands-on, we can provide them with language for the task, even if it's very simple chunks, such as, God, can you lend me the scissors? Pass me the glue. All of these are opportunities for them to practice their English. After this, learners would present their instruments to the group and have this opportunity to give and to receive feedback. I'm going to need to get more water. I think my partner is watching and he can fetch me more water if he's listening actively, as I hope he is. And so after they have presented and received feedback, then they could go back to reflect on the process, make the necessary changes to their musical instruments, see what worked, see what didn't work, and then make the necessary adaptations. So this is these are just some images of what these instruments could look like. And as you can see, it's nothing too complex. And sometimes when teachers think of STEAM, the first thing we think of is high tech, right? Like, oh, I'm going to need to have computers or a tablet per child, which is probably very unrealistic. But as you can see, we're using concepts of engineering and of technology, but using household items, so it doesn't need to be high tech. There are lots of low tech possibilities for STEAM. All right, the second project is something I thought about with older teenagers. So teens and maybe late teens, which would be to make a guide to activities or making a city guide for activities that teenagers can do in the city. I had this idea when I was working. Thank you. So I had this idea when I was working with a group of teenagers. And we were talking about a unit in which we were talking about entertainment options and things that we like to do on the weekend. And my teenagers told me, there isn't anything to do in São Paulo other than go to a shopping mall on the weekend. And this really stuck with me because and then I tried to tell them, like, come on, what are you talking about? We live in São Paulo. We have such a rich cultural life. But for learners, they're like, oh no, the only thing we can do on the weekend is go to a shopping mall. So we did this project in which students had to make a guide to activities that teenagers could do in their city. And in the detail phase, we would need to better understand this, of why do we have this impression? Why do we only go to shopping malls? And to talk to other people, non-teens in São Paulo, maybe teachers, maybe their parents, to see, okay, what do other people do on the weekends that isn't go to a shopping mall? In the discovery phase, then the students would research, and remember, this would all be done in English, to research guides and use the internet to find, what are some ideas of places, activities, things that they can do to gather the information that they would include in their guides. When it's time to apply, students would go ahead and make their actual guides, whether this is high tech or low tech, depending on your teaching context. And I'll show you some examples in a second. And then where they could, after that, they would present their guides to the group and go through the process of reflecting on this, making the necessary changes, and finally having their finished guide. Exactly, making their adaptations. So what I said about having high-tech or low-tech options, this, of course, would depend on your context. So this guide, if you have a low-tech situation, or if you want to explore this area, you don't really want to use the internet or or a computer. If you want to do it, old school and have a very low-tech guide, great, fantastic. Students are still applying art, engineering into creating an illustrated guide, for instance. Or if you want to work with something that's more high tech, then students could create their guides having a specific, producing their own Google Maps page where they could select these places, and then for each of the places, write a comment, for instance, about what the teenagers can do in these different places of the city, these different parts of the city. And if you wanted something even more high tech, depending if your learners all have mobile phones, if you feel like this would be appropriate, of creating a vlog. So saying, okay, you guys have to create a 2-minute vlog or a 3-minute vlog, which is your guide to things that things that teenagers can do in São Paulo, which isn't go to a shopping mall. So as you can see, we can have these adaptations, and you can make these adaptations depending on your learning context and whichever project that you did. They are applying and going through the whole STEAM process of being inquisitive, of asking critical questions, of collaborating, of working and practicing their creativity to reach and solve this problem and then in the end they would have, and delivering this project, delivering this result that they could then share with other teenagers. So the next time a friend of theirs was like, oh my God, we're going to go to another shopping mall this weekend, there's nothing to do in São Paulo. Actually, take a look. I have this guide. And like we said, this is a huge boost of confidence for learners. It shows how applicable, right? How they're actually helping people. So here I took just some other fast ideas to show some of the different possibilities of STEAM. So I really like this idea here. If we're working with young learners and you're working with a storybook, for instance, we read The Gingerbread Man. You can take, there's lots of possibilities for how to create STEAM activities from books, right? From storybooks, from literature. So they read a storybook. Okay, we read The Gingerbread Man. Okay, now we're going to build a boat that the gingerbread man would use to cross the river. How do we make this boat float? What material are we going to use? What material floats? What material sinks? Or for instance, we read a book and now our project is going to be, we're going to build a little house for this character. Or imagine, what would this specific character's house look like from this book that we read together? Or how can we make a herb garden with limited space and materials, right? If we would like to learn how to cook, or if we would like to have more healthy meals. Now considering our context, how can we make our classroom or our school safer during the pandemic? Maybe you're going to make some sort of apparatus for hand sanitizer. A classic one is, how can we make a game, whether it's a board game or something online, to teach others about whatever subject it is that you are studying. Things related to the environment, like how can we detect pollution in our city, in our school. This is a project that came up with one of my group of learners. How can we improve the acoustics in our classroom? This idea came to me when I was teaching in a classroom, and the classroom was all tiled. So it was tiled walls from floor to ceiling. And whenever we played a video or a listening extract, the sound was terrible because it reverberated and it was really hard for us to understand. So this idea came up of, okay, how can we improve the acoustics in our classroom? It's a real problem, and let's get to it to try to improve the situation. So as you can see, there's lots of possibilities depending on the age that you're working with, depending on if you're going to use the content it was that you were exploring, or like this, use a book for a springboard. There's lots of possibilities, and I think it's just important for us to remember that they don't need to be very high tech. But if we are using, and if we are keeping in mind, what are these pillars, right? Am I promoting inquiry? Am I promoting critical thinking? Am I encouraging the use of this intersection between two of these areas, right? From science, technology, engineering, arts, and maths? Then great. Then that's it, right? Exactly. I see lots of you saying thinking outside the box, adapting to your group. That's it. So here I have a short list of resources that can be helpful. And afterwards, I'm going to have, I see some questions popping up. Towards the end, I'm going to have a few minutes to answer these. So we have, I know one of teachers' main concerns, and mine also as a teacher, of course, is workload. Sometimes we see great ideas, but that they would be extremely time-consuming to prepare. Sometimes we don't have all of that time. We don't have all of those resources at hand. So I think it's important for us to take a look at what already exists and what can help us, right? So at Cultura Inglesa, we have a new partnership, which is very exciting, with the Royal Institution from the UK, which promotes scientific thinking and research. So we have been using their videos and their products quite a lot that have lots of ideas of experiments and projects to engage with students. But I've brought here some of these ideas. These are some YouTube channels that have cool ideas of projects that you could do. So Utopia, Code.org, Left Brain, Craft Brain, Red TED Art, and Babble Dabble Do. If you take a look at these, you'll find some interesting projects and see what makes sense, what do you think would be interesting for your learners, what fits into whatever content it is that you are teaching. Here, and like I said, I'm going to make these slides available. So here we have an Ultimate S.T.E.A.M resource pack, which has ideas and worksheets of things and how to organize a lesson, these stages of the lesson. You have a more in-depth explanation of these steps. Here we have a list of 40 different websites and apps that you could use depending on what it is that you're exploring, which is really, really great. I found lots of really interesting new tools that I didn't know before. This is a website called Teachers Pay Teachers, which has lots of already ready-made handouts and workouts. So here, and despite the name, there are lots of free activities, so you don't have to pay for anything. Because sometimes we'll spend a lot of time making a handout or a printout for students to complete for a project when maybe you already have stuff that's ready online. Take a look at this Netflix series. It's called Brainchild. It's really great for ideas. If you have kids of your own, watch them with you. You can watch, with them, or just take a look to find some possible ideas. And if you want to teach computer science, this website, Love Letter for Computers, helps to give ideas of how you can teach different aspects of computer science in a way that's very tangible. Even if you aren't really that tech savvy, it has great ideas of how you can teach this and work with this in class. So before we open up for questions, as I can see some here, I'd wanted to finish off on this quote, which is that the goal of education is the development of a person with character and humane convictions who understands the great art of constructive and harmonious living. I think this is really great, and this really summarizes some of the ideas of what it is that we're teaching, what it is that we should aim to be teaching, and contributing to the education of students who are people of character with humane convictions and who understand the importance of working constructively and harmoniously. All right, so as I said, I'm going to make, this is all available. You can scan this QR code to have access to these slides. And I'm going to take a look now at the questions. We have a few minutes, so let me find some of the questions here. All right, so all right, so Priscilla asked, how frequently do we need to use this type of class? Now, this is something that's totally adaptable. I think you can, depending on how much Well, freedom, you have to suggest this to your course coordinator or the manager of your institution. And of course, of what makes sense within your group. So it's something that you could try to experiment and say with students, okay, so next week we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to have a STEAM week. What is STEAM? What are we going to explore? It could be that. You could have it, once a month and make it, a tradition of like, okay, so once a month we're going to have a STEAM class. It's totally flexible of what would make sense within your learning context. Totally adaptable. Great. Janaki asked, is it possible to give this kind of class for adults? Totally. If you think about it, you would, of course, need to adapt so that it wouldn't be something patronizing. I know that if my adult learners, if I said, okay, now we're going to need to color in and make, color in a map, make this little map of, it could be seen as patronizing or infantilizing. But if we think about whatever topic it is that you are exploring, so imagine I'm with my group of adult learners and we are talking about job interviews. So something very adult from the adult universe. We've been talking about job interviews. We did a few, practice job interviews. Okay, the problem is that a lot of people still feel very, very anxious for a job interview, right? So maybe that's the problem I want to solve. And then maybe the students could put together a guide in whatever format they found. Maybe it's an infographic, maybe it's a video, maybe it's a short podcast episode in audio in which they're going to give tips on, surviving a job interview or how to excel in your next job interview. So this could be, I think it's definitely possible to do with adults. The idea is to keep the core ideas of STEAM, right? Then that's fine. It's definitely adaptable. Great. So let me see. Yes. Great. All right, I see that Helen asked, do you have any tips about applying working with STEAM with students who have special needs? All right, excellent. Now, specifically, I haven't investigated into this specifically for STEAM for special needs, but I think here it would be important for us to understand what exactly are these special needs of my learners, right? Because then there are solutions depending on what are the specific needs of my learners. So for instance, if I'm working with a student who has dyslexia, there are adaptations that you could make regarding, okay, so the handout that we're working with, I'm going to change the font so that it's easier for my students with dyslexia to understand and to work with this project, right? If it's a student maybe who has special cognitive needs, that maybe you could transform and make adaptations like, okay, so instead of using text form, this student can produce, images, right? Can use more with images if they struggle with writing, for instance. So depending on the type of special need that your student has, there's definitely adaptations that you can make to make it accessible, right? Definitely. Okay, Darcy asked, during the COVID-19 pandemic, what suggestion do you have to do oral tests? Here, I'm not sure if you're referring to like the oral component of STEAM. If so, that's what I understood. And in terms of testing, this is something we didn't mention, but it's important to think that when we're talking about assessment in STEAM, we're not going to evaluate it like a traditional test, right? So what I would recommend would be to establish a rubric for each project. And then this could be done with your learners, right? So with your learners, come up with a rubric for what makes sense of how you're going to evaluate this project. So if we take the musical instrument one, for example, your rubric could be something like, does your instrument make music, right? Or did you use, and then you could establish that the instrument needs to have at least 2 parts or needs to use at least 3 different types of materials. Did you use the appropriate materials? Or then, as you were saying, for the oral component, was the presentation clear? Were you able to transmit your ideas clearly? And then this could be done virtually, yes, presenting via Zoom or Google Meet or whatever platform you would be. But then I think the issue of assessment that you raised is important, to know that you wouldn't be assessing these projects as you would a test, right? Okay, so Louisa asked, can these types of activities be adapted to virtual classes, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic? I think so, for sure. Something that you could do would be to think about, in moments where students would be working collaboratively, there are different tools that we can use for students to interact together, right? Where they could, whether it's brainstorming or sketching, having a Google Jamboard could be a good place for them to sketch together, or post-its with their ideas. So we have some of these substitutions of these online collaborative tools that could help out a lot with that. And if you were going to make something that's more hands-on, like the musical instrument idea, then of course you could have students working with the materials that they have at home. You would need, of course, I would do this liaise with parents beforehand, so you don't have the kids going, Mom, I need to go out and buy lots of stuff for English class. No, tell parents before, try to organize it minimally so that students are aware that they can use the materials they have at home, make sure that parents are aware, and that you could do this, then through the webcam, guide them, help them out in assembling their musical instruments, for instance. I'm scrolling through to take a look to see if we have any more questions. Thank you, thank you. Great, thank you for your questions. Do we have any more questions? I don't think so. All right. Thank you very much for your attention, for being here, for your kind words. I'm happy to hear it was of help. I hope this encourages you to explore STEAM, to see that it's something that is manageable, that is something we can explore with our students, that will bring definitely lots of valuable production, lots of learning for our students, and hopefully you can then adapt them and make them come true in your own learning contexts. And I'll give you a second if you need to, if you are able to, if you want to scan the QR code to have the slides, then you can access it and you'll have all of the links available. All right? Thank you. Take care, everyone. Stay safe, stay home, and happy teaching.